Jeremy Sochan, born May 20th, 2003. In movies, a double agent is someone who secretly works for both sides. In sports, it's usually just a joke. But Jeremy Sochan is about as close as you will get. After beginning this season in San Antonio, he was waived and eventually landed with the New York Knicks. Now, just months later, he's preparing to face the very franchise that drafted him in the NBA Finals. Few players ever find themselves in that position. But while the double agent storyline is fun, it's not the part of this story that interests me the most. What interests me is how Jeremy Sochan got here in the first place. Because 4 years ago, the Spurs didn't draft him to become a role player bouncing between teams. They selected him 9th overall and viewed him as one of the building blocks of their future. This was supposed to be a versatile forward who could impact winning on both ends of the floor and eventually grow into a major piece of the next era of Spurs basketball. Instead, the more I look back at his journey, the more confused I become. The shooting concerns were there, the offensive limitations were there, even the college production wasn't particularly overwhelming. Yet somehow Jeremy Sochan became a top 10 pick anyway. Today, we're taking a look at one of the most puzzling draft selections of the last decade and why a player once viewed as part of San Antonio's future ended up watching that future from the other side. What happened? Let's talk about it. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth. Let's get it, man. Like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know who I should do next. Jeremy Sochan is a 6'8" forward from Guyman, Oklahoma, though much of his upbringing took place overseas after his family moved to England. The son of a former basketball player, Sochan developed an unconventional path to the NBA, playing for youth leagues in Europe before emerging as one of the top international prospects in his class. His versatility, size, and potential on defense quickly attracted attention from major college programs, eventually leading him to Baylor University. At Baylor, Sochan played just one season and averaged 9.2 points, 6.4 rebounds, and 1.8 assists per game while helping the Bears reach the NCAA tournament. While his raw production wasn't overwhelming to say the least, scouts were intrigued by his ability to guard multiple positions, handle the ball in transition, and impact games without needing plays called for him, which I never thought he showed or even really understood. He earned Big 12 Six-Man of the Year honors and was named to the conference all-freshman team despite starting only a handful of games and putting up moderate numbers. Evaluators somehow projected him as a modern positionless forward capable of switching defensively, facilitating offense, and eventually developing enough skills to thrive in today's NBA. Questions about his shooting consistency and overall offensive polish existed, but many viewed those concerns as, quote, fixable. That's right, an NBA team used a top 10 pick on a guy who had skills described as fixable. The San Antonio Spurs' Brian Wright and his team drafted Sochan with the hopes he could somehow be made into a part of their future. That never happened. Stunt number 1, the jumper was broken from the start. When people talk about Jeremy Sochan's NBA struggles, they usually point to his lack of offensive development. The truth is, there wasn't much offensive development to begin with. The warning signs were present long before he ever put on a Spurs jersey. At Baylor, Sochan shot just 29.6% from 3 and 58.9% from the foul line. For most prospects, those numbers would immediately raise concerns. For a modern forward expected to play in a spacing-heavy NBA, they should have set off alarms. Instead, the Spurs convinced themselves the shot would eventually come around. It never did. Once Sochan reached the NBA, defenders quickly realized they had little reason to respect him as a shooter. They sagged off him, packed the paint, and dared him to make outside shots. Night after night, opponents willingly gave him space because the risk of him beating them from deep was minimal. The result was a player on offense constantly operating in crowded driving lanes with fewer opportunities to create anything meaningful, and that's where the entire foundation of his game started to crumble. His supporters often pointed to the ball handling, passing, and versatility. The problem is that those skills become far less effective when defenses don't have to guard you honestly. It's hard to create advantages when defenders are already sitting in help position waiting for you to drive. Even his occasional flashes as a playmaker were limited because teams weren't worried about him scoring first. To make matters worse, his shooting form became a story of its own. Over the years, adjustments were made, mechanics were tweaked, and routines changed, yet the results remained largely the same. He couldn't and still can't shoot. Instead of becoming a strength, shooting remained the weakness that followed him everywhere. That's why it's difficult to separate Sochan's other shortcomings from his jumper. The lack of shooting wasn't just one flaw amongst many, it was the flaw that magnified everything else. The Spurs drafted him hoping the shot would improve enough to unlock the rest of his game. Instead, the opposite happened. The jumper never developed, and without it, much of the offensive upside scouts imagined simply never materialized. The player San Antonio thought they were drafting existed more in theory than in reality, and this theory was one only they could see. Stunt number 2, the point guard experiment. By Jeremy Sochan's second season, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the offensive game the Spurs scouts envisioned wasn't materializing. The jumper remained unreliable, teams continued daring him to shoot, and the production simply wasn't matching what you would expect from a top 10 pick. At that point, most organizations would have simplified a player's role and focused on helping him master the things he already did well. Instead, the Spurs went in the opposite direction. They handed Sochan the ball and attempted one of the more unusual experiments in recent NBA memory by turning him into a point guard. On the surface, the idea sounded innovative. Sochan was 6'8", could handle the ball reasonably well for his size, and had shown flashes of passing ability. The Spurs believed that putting him in a lead playmaking role could accelerate his development and unlock another layer to his game. The problem was that successful point guards usually possess at least one skill that forces defenses to react. Some have elite shooting, others have elite speed, scoring ability, court vision, or creativity. Sochan didn't have any of those traits at a high enough level, or any level he's proven. Defenders routinely went under screens because they weren't concerned about his jumper. They packed the paint because they weren't worried about him beating them athletically or finishing creatively either. Instead of creating advantages for the offense, he often found himself trying to operate against defenses that were perfectly comfortable letting him make decisions. What's fascinating is that experiment may have unintentionally exposed the flaw in the original evaluation. The Spurs drafted Sochan because they believed he could become a positionless player capable of doing a little bit of everything. 4 years later, they were still searching for the position that best suited him. He wasn't a scorer, he wasn't a true point guard, he wasn't a primary creator, and he wasn't impactful enough defensively to make those offensive shortcomings irrelevant. Rather than answering questions about his future, the point guard experiment created even more. Looking back, it felt less like a development plan and more like an organization searching for a way to justify a draft pick that wasn't producing the expected results. By the time the experiment ended, one thing had become clear. The Spurs were not discovering a hidden star. They were discovering the limits of a player they may have misjudged from the very beginning. Stunt number 3, the development failed. By the end of Jeremy Sochan's 4th NBA season, the conversation was no longer about potential. It was no longer about upside, versatility, or what he might become with more time. At some point, every player reaches a stage where teams stop projecting and start evaluating results. For Sochan, that moment arrived faster than expected, and the results weren't encouraging. The Spurs spent 4 years trying to develop him. They worked on his jump shot, they changed his mechanics, they experimented with his role, they even tried turning him into a point guard. Most young players are asked to fit into a system. Sochan was given the rare opportunity to have the system adjusted around him. The organization did everything it could to find a version of Jeremy Sochan that worked in today's NBA. Unfortunately, that version never showed up. The shooting never became respectable, the scoring never took off, the point guard experiment failed. Even the defensive impact that once made him intriguing never developed into the game-changing strength many expected. Instead of adding new skills to his game each year, Sochan often looked like the same player with the same questions attached to him. For a 9th overall pick, that's a major problem. What's most surprising is that the Spurs remained patient for as long as they did. Draft position brought him opportunities that many players never receive. Had he been a late first-round pick or second-round selection producing the same results, it's fair to wonder if he would have lasted nearly as long. Yet, despite all the patience, all the development plans, and all the experimentation, San Antonio ultimately reached the same conclusions everyone else was from the beginning. The project wasn't working. The irony is that Jeremy Sochan now finds himself in the NBA Finals. he'll receive a championship ring if the Knicks win, and because he spent a part of the season with San Antonio, he could potentially receive one if the Spurs win as well. That's an incredible outcome for a player whose value around the league may be lower now than at any point in his career. After appearing in just 16 games for New York and missing the Eastern Conference semifinals with hamstring issues, Sochan enters the offseason with more questions than answers and a guaranteed championship. 4 years after being drafted 9th overall, the development failed, and he's still searching for the players scouts thought they were drafting back in 2022. All in all, Jeremy Sochan's NBA career is a reminder that potential and production aren't the same thing. The Spurs drafted him 9th overall, believing they could develop a raw but versatile prospect into a cornerstone piece of their future. Instead, 4 years later, they moved on before his rookie contract was even complete. The biggest issue wasn't that he failed to become a star. Plenty of lottery picks fall short of star expectations. The issue is that the skill scouts expected him to develop never truly existed. The jumper never became reliable, the offensive game never expanded, and after years of patience, the development simply didn't produce the player San Antonio thought they saw. Ironically, Sochan now finds himself on the biggest stage in basketball. As the Knicks prepare to face the Spurs in the NBA Finals, the former 9th overall pick has somehow ended up on both sides of a championship matchup. But while he'll be able to say he won a ring, the bigger question is what comes next. Because after 4 seasons, Jeremy Sochan is no longer being evaluated on potential. He's being evaluated on results, and unfortunately for him, those results never matched the expectations that came with being a top 10 pick. Salute, much respect, but for these reasons, his growth was stunted. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth, and I'm out.